Listen to Science, der Wissenschaftspodcast der Volkswagen Stiftung.
Professor West is one of America's most prominent, prolific, and provocative intellectuals. So where to begin with someone who's not only an author, but also such a multidimensional person and figure, with such unusual range, someone who is indeed an academic celebrity? What to say in 10 minutes to give at least a small glimpse into the life and work of someone who, as he writes in his memoir, Brother West, likes to move in 5 different directions at the same time. And I'm afraid he's not as good with numbers as with words and ideas, because I find him moving in at least 7 directions at the same time. So I could tell you the usual story. First, I could tell you about his academic career, how he went to Harvard University, then on to Union Theological Seminary, soon afterwards became a part-time teacher at Yale, then receiving full-time tenured position at Yale, being the first Black person tenured by Yale's Divinity School. For the academics among us, he was 29. That makes you feel good. He has also taught at Princeton University, at Harvard University, the University of Paris. He holds more than 20 honorary degrees. Who's counting? He's now back at Union Theological Seminary in Harlem, a place certainly less known internationally, but the place where he feels called to teach more than in any other place. This already shows how important his calling is in his life. When you look at his work, 2 influences become apparent over and over again. His calling, which is in close connection to the Black church, that also influences his oratory style, which you will see in a minute, and his family. In an interview, he talked about the importance of his family, its importance for self-confidence, and he does so with an incredible, joyful dosage of self-irony. He said, and I quote, "A key for me was that my family's love has always supported me. When I came to Harvard, I may not have been ready intellectually, but I sure was in terms of confidence. For instance, when I first was in a sociology class and the professor started talking about Max Weber, pronouncing it in proper German as Weber, it took me a while to figure out that he was discussing the same Weber who wrote about the Protestant ethic, the person I had already read. But because I was determined from the start to use my education and not have my education use me, I was able to catch up pretty quickly." And boy, he has. Second, I could tell you the story of his best-selling writing. Among his numerous publications, more than 20 books, I want to single out 2 texts that have become classics. His 1993 bestseller, Race Matters, is a thought-provoking search for the meaning of America, going beyond the traditional race debate. Here, West is critical of both the traditional liberal and the conservative positions on race, as both put African Americans as the problem. He sees the liberal notion that wants more government programs to solve racial problems as simplistic, because it focuses solely on the economic dimension. And he criticizes the conservative idea that what is needed is a change in the moral behavior of the poor Black, as ignoring public responsibility for immoral circumstances. His sequel to the classic Race Matters, similarly, has become a bestseller. In Democracy Matters, West gives an unflinching critique and richly nuanced vision of American democracy. The book points out how the dominating anti-democratic dogmas fuel what he calls the present age of the American empire. He analyzes 3 great anti-democratic threats: the dogma of free market fundamentalism, the dogma of aggressive militarism, the dogma of escalating authoritarianism, rooted in what he calls an understandable paranoia toward potential terrorists, but which at the same time is widening the scope of repressing rights and civil liberties. A quick note, Dr. West wrote this book in 2004, long before it became obvious through the NSA affair. How does West react to these observations? Not only by speaking critically, but also by keeping faith, as another book title of his puts it. Despite of, or rather because of the dark and tragic comic, he is in search of the deep democratic tradition, turning to the web of interconnections between the academy, mass media, prisons, churches, and the street. What are his search engines? The moral pillars of Socratic questioning, the prophetic commitment to justice, and a hope as exhibited in the Black freedom struggle, strongly influenced by Black music, especially blues and jazz. Which leads us to the third story I could tell you about Cornel West. He has worked extensively on, with, and in popular music culture, perhaps most prominently through his appearances in the Matrix trilogy. But most importantly, though, he wrote about the various genres of Black music, drawing analogies from bebop to techno-funk to rap, arguing that Black rap music combines the two major organic artistic traditions in Black America, Black rhetoric and Black music. But Cornel West wouldn't be Cornel West if he only talked about music. He made 3 spoken words albums, collaborating with artists such as Prince and Jill Scott. Due to his outstanding work, he has received much praise. So here are some voices from academia and the mainstream press. And I know this is going to make you feel uncomfortable. Try not to listen for a minute. He has been called uncompromising, unconventional, exciting, illuminating, an eloquent prophet with attitude. He excites, angers, validates, and causes one to think analytically and critically about the world. As a scholar, theologian, and activist, Cornel West has built a reputation as one of the most eloquent voices in America's racial debate. He elevates this debate to new intellectual and moral levels. He confronts the reader with profound and unsettling insights. You can listen again now. But these 3 stories can be read up on in his books or the internet. So here is story number 4, and that is what I really want to tell you about my friend Cornel. What makes a really great writer, a great person, a great rebel? What makes Cornel so precious and so rare? He is always awake, wide awake, works tirelessly, trying to change the world, to make it a better place, to give to people, most importantly, to ordinary, underserved people. As a prophetic pragmatist, Cornel does what he preaches. With great courage, kind-hearted compassion, true integrity, deep love, and a strong sense for social justice, he gives, he shares. Walking down the streets in New York, I always see him giving money, and I mean big bills, to the needy. He regularly teaches philosophy in a prison, talking to and working with people usually lost out of sight. Even when he's on sabbatical, he is there for his students. And he's there for people who want his support for a good cause, be it a progressive demonstration on the street or a soup kitchen in Harlem. Moreover, when people of a different conviction or politics want to enter an open dialogue, he is happy and takes all sides into account. His level of mind, heart, soul, and if I may say so, style, puts him in a league of his own. This is a man who cares deeply very deeply about humanity and justice, about international politics just as much as about the people on the street and in prison. I know of no finer public servant and more dedicated intellectual to open this festival on justice. So please join me in welcoming Professor Cornel West.
Let me first say I am blessed to be here in this historic city of Hanover. I want to thank my very dear sister and distinguished colleague for those very, very moving and poignant words. And I'm deeply inspired by your analysis, and I have to see whether I'm convinced whether I can in any way aspire to meet the standards that you have put forward here. I want to salute my dear brother Mayor of Hanover. Give him another hand. Give him another hand. For those very kind. One cannot think of a better place to have a festival of philosophy than a city that produced one of the finest, if not the finest, philosophical genius of early modernity. I'm talking about the great Leibniz, Renaissance man of his day. And then, of course, in the barbaric and bestial dark 20th century, Hannah Arendt herself emerges out of this place. I want to salute the Vice President of the University. Thank you so very much for your presence. Thank you so very much for your words. I want to acknowledge the caretaker, the executive director, the visionary leader of this institution. What a beautiful space this is. And when I walked in and I told my dear sister, we're talking about justice and democracy, small d, in the castle. I said, absolutely, because as a Democrat, small d, and as a revolutionary Christian, I embrace all. Ex-kings, queens, royalty, lumpen proletariat across the board. It's a human affair. And of course, I cannot in any way overlook my new friend and dear brother, Jürgen Mannemann, who is one of the most important forces for good, not just in Hanover, not just in Germany, but in Europe and the world. He, of course, is a student of the inimitable Johann Baptist Metz. We were blessed to have a wonderful conversation with him last night in Munster. And his legacy continues even as his life is a testimony to you and I and so many others who have been wrestling with the problem of evil, with theodicy, not simply anchored in the Shoah and the Holocaust with our precious Jewish brothers and sisters here in Germany, but it's manifested in every attempt of elites to lose sight of those the great Franz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. I want to salute Brother Jürgen and also his beloved wife, Birgit, as well as Brother Thilo. Give all three of them a hand, please. Give all three of them a hand. There's also a very special intellectual philosopher, my dear brother. He's a professor at Rice University. His name is Anthony Penn. He's one of the most important voices of his generation. He's built on the great legacy of William Jones, who was the first black professor at Yale Divinity School. And he's been wrestling with the issue of humanism. Where is my dear brother? Just raise your hand. It's so good to have you here. So good to have you here, brother. Very, very much so. I want to begin with two epigraphs. The first is from Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr was probably the most important religious intellectual to emerge out of the American empire in the 20th century. He wrote a classic called Moral Man and Immoral Society in 1932. And if you were to turn to page 257 of that text, he says, any justice that is only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. Justice must be rescued by something deeper than justice, namely love. And the second epigraph is from the greatest public intellectual of the 20th century, again, within the context of the American Empire. He studied in Berlin for 3 years, studied with Max Weber for a semester. I got Weber together, indeed, indeed. And I'm talking about the one and only W.E.B. Du Bois. 89 years old. Just emerged 6 years from a U.S. court with handcuffs, working with the Peace Information Center, trying to ban nuclear weapons across the board. And the U.S. government put him under FBI surveillance. He was viewed as a communist, even though he was simply concerned about the wretched of the earth. At 89 years old, he decides to write 3 novels, a trilogy. And you turn to page 275 of that first novel, The Ordeal of Man's Art. Du Bois writes in the voice of the character, Man's Art. I have been wrestling with these 4 questions all of my life and have yet to provide an adequate set of answers. The first question, how does integrity face oppression? Second question, what does honesty do in the face of deception? The third query, what does decency do in the face of insult? And that last powerful question, how does virtue face brute force? Niebuhr on the one hand, Du Bois on the other, setting a framework for me to reflect on this highly complicated and complex notion of justice. The relation of justice and love. Brother Martin Luther King used to say, justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is not identical with love. It's not reducible to love, but it is inseparable from love. Then the question becomes, love of what? We begin with Philosophia, love of wisdom, philosophy. What an audacious discipline. What an audacious discourse to follow the great Pierre Hadot. What an audacious way of life. Those of us who claim to have the courage to pursue Philosophia, philosophy of love of wisdom. And yet you can hear Du Bois in the background. Integrity, honesty, decency, virtue. Look at line 38a of Plato's Apology, the starting point of the Western philosophical tradition. The unexamined life is not worth living for the human. And one can hear Martin King in the background saying, the examined life is painful. It takes courage to examine oneself, to fall in love with wisdom, to engage in a self-invested, fallible quest for wisdom. It's no accident that our English word human and humility derived from the Latin humando, which means bearing or burying, that we are organisms, creatures on the way to death. We've got a very distinguished scholar of Heidegger from Japan here, and we salute him. He's one of the fellows here at the Institute for Philosophical Research. And we know Heidegger himself, even given his very ugly relations to gangsters called Nazis, he's still a philosophic genius. Like Ezra Pound, fascist but still worth reading in order to separate the genius from the thuggery. And yet Vico is where I start, not Heidegger. Because Vico talks not about death, he talks about corpses. That's the beginning of the new science. That's his critique of Descartes. Descartes, philosopher who falls in love with geometry, mathematics, the new physics and science. Vico, philosopher who falls in love with poetry, music, story, narrative, history. This is the great fissure in modern European philosophy. Vico on the one hand, poetry, music, story, narrative, history. Descartes on the other, mathematics, geometry, science. Of course, we need both. Of course, they go hand in hand. But we also have to make a choice in terms of our preferences. It reminds me of line 607b5 of Plato's Republic in Book 10, where he talks about the traditional quarrel of philosophy and poetry, and Plato's great attempt to displace Homer and Homeric narrative as the source of paideia, the source of deep education, with Platonic dialogues and dialectic and philosophy. What a tension, what a struggle going on. And when we talk about justice, not just political justice, but our very sense of feeling justified as beings on the way to becoming corpses. I fall back on my own tradition, the Black freedom tradition, that says what sits at the center of our movement, from Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth, from Fannie Lou Hamer to Martin King, is a question of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces? That's who we are. Put on my three-piece suit if I want to and act like I'm so-and-so. But if it were not for my mother's love push, I wouldn't be here. And one day my body will be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. The move from womb to tomb. To wrestle with what it means to be in time and space, and have to make choices of what kind of human being we will choose to be in the short time that we are here. And that's not simply a political question, it's an existential issue. We have funk masters of George Clinton and Bootsy Collins of my generation that remind us we all emerge in the funk, in our mama's womb. And the worms get us, that's funky too. Which means that there's no time for deodorized discourses that deny darkness and death. There's no time for sanitized and sterilized discourses that deny grief and anguish and agony. And that's why any serious talk about justice has to begin with wrestling with forms of death. One of the criticisms I have of American civilization, even as I acknowledge I'm very much a product of American civilization, which means I have my own parochialism and provincialism. But one of the problems in the history of the United States is that we have tended as an American people to be death-denying, death-dodging, death-ducking people. That's why when you look at our U.S. Constitution, you do not see a reference to social death, U.S. slavery. No reference whatsoever to 22% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies whose very labor generated the wealth which constituted the precondition for American democracy. And sooner or later, chickens come home to roost. You reap what you sow. You end up with a civil war of 750,000 precious human beings dead over an institution not invoked in your Constitution. Peter Pan mentality. Forever young, forever innocent. Not me, no. Pure, pristine. The great F.O. Matheson used to say American civilization may be unique among modern civilizations to move from innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity. It's not a matter of growing wealthy and growing powerful and growing big, but the question is growing up. That's maturity. Spiritual maturity. Cultural maturity. And the benchmark of growing up is always what? I see some folk in here who've grown up. They know what I'm talking about. Humility. Vulnerability, and still a tenacity to keep on going at it. The way Samuel Beckett put it, try again, fail again, fail better. Try again, fail again, fail better. His last piece of prose fiction called Worstward Whole. Page 91. That's the lapse Protestant genius from Ireland named Samuel Beckett. And he talks about the mess. What it means to be in space and time is wrestling with the mess and what I've called the funk. You see. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that in part is, especially in our educational institutions, I tell my students, for 37 years I've been blessed to teach. And I tell them over and over again, when you enter my classroom, you have entered this space in order to learn how to die, in order to maybe wrestle with issues such that you will learn how to live well. And they go hand in hand. In any serious talk about justice, it's about learning how to live well with maturity, honesty, decency, virtue that Du Bois invoked at 89 years old. Well, what do you mean, learn how to die? Well, you all know, of course, that Book 12 of Part 1 of Montaigne's great essays. Montaigne, in many ways, is probably the greatest of all the early European philosophers. He doesn't fit well in highly professionalized philosophy departments because they're looking for a rigor and they're looking for a certain theoretical coherence and a logical consistency. Whereas Montaigne says, before Walt Whitman's got to it, I contain contradictions. I'm shot through with incoherencies. There's a sense in which I don't really know who I am, but I'm going to put it on the page so people will have to come to terms with it. And what does he say in that book 12? To philosophize is to learn how to die. And even Seneca, and we don't expect too much philosophic profundity from the Romans. They're so busy conquering the world. But Seneca says, he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. Because the process of learning how to die, which is the deepest process of education, of paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, and of course, German brothers and sisters talk about Bildung at its best. Self-examination and interrogation. Anytime you examine certain assumptions and presuppositions you have and let them go, that's a form of death. And there is no maturation, no maturity. There's no development. There's no existential rebirth without death. Anytime you examine a prejudgment or a presupposition or a prejudice that one has and one gives it up, it's a form of death. So to fall in love with wisdom is not just to wrestle with forms of death, the death inside of you that needs to be transformed and undergo a metamorphosis so that you emerge a stronger, more critical, more engaged agent in space and time. And of course, in the Christian New Testament, with our Jewish brother Paul, he says Christians must learn how to die daily. Die daily. Dorothy Day, one of the greatest of all of the Catholic. You all know Dorothy Day? Oh, I love Dorothy Day. They're trying to make her a saint even in the Catholic Church. And I can just hear her saying, a saint ain't nothing but a sinner who looks at the world through the lens of the heart. That's all I did. But Dorothy Day wrote when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot down April 4th, 1968 in the Catholic Worker. She said, Martin Luther King Jr. learned how to die daily, and he taught me how to die daily. Self-criticism, self-critique. What's inside of us. Great William Butler Yeats, probably the finest English poet of the 20th century, our dear Irish brother, used to say it takes more courage to examine the dark corners of their own soul than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. Courage to die, to criticize, to scrutinize, to give up certain assumptions, to give up certain dogma, give up certain doctrine, and it always hurts. And this is part of our challenge in universities. I don't know what it's like in Germany, but in the United States, our universities are not sites of courage. They are sites of young people to learn how to be smart. And I say, that's true. And I say, let the phones be smart. Let's try to be wise. And you're being smart for what? To make money. Wu-Tang Clan says cream, cash rules everything around me. The rule of big money, big banks, big corporations, cupidity shot through, displacing integrity, venality, open oneself to be sold because everybody's for sale. Everything is for sale in a market-driven world with commodification and commercialization and marketization shot through every nook and cranny of our lives. What space is left for what Du Bois called integrity, decency, honesty, and virtue? No, we teach our students to learn how to die, to critically examine themselves so they can muster the courage to learn how to live, to straighten their backs up and not in any way be manipulated by oligarchs and plutocrats and corporate media, or oligarchs and plutocrats, oftentimes disproportionately shaping, molding our politicians. I'm glad we have a blessed mayor here. He can be a counterexample. But he knows better than any of us the pressures coming from above, as well as the needs for those below, our poor peoples, working peoples, our blessed Turkish immigrants and others who have to somehow negotiate and navigate our beloved Islamic brothers and sisters and Muslim brothers and sisters in a country that for so long has understood itself as profoundly Christian, however you unpack that particular word. How do we, in some sense, keep track with the humanity of those who are often overlooked and downplayed? Socratic questioning that looks at the world from the vantage point of the wretched of the earth. Now, it's no accident, I think, that Socrates, of course, never wrote a word, but he's never depicted as ever shedding a tear. He never cries. You read Plato's dialogues, Xenophon's dialogues, of course, the satirical depiction of Socrates and Aristophanes is the clouds. And he never cries. And you say, well, wait a minute. Anybody who's never cried has never really fallen in love with a person, not just wisdom. You say, was he married? Yeah, he was married to Xanthippe. He had sons, 3 of them. Well, okay, he cried. They didn't pick it up in the narrative. That's all. But Socrates never shedding a tear. I share this concern with the great Thomas More. You recall Thomas More in the Tower of London, writing his great dialogues of tribulation. He says, why is it that Socrates never cries and Jesus never laughs? This is the query that might provide some of the key to what's missing in so much of the history of Western civilization, giving those 2 founding figures, the death of Socrates, 399 BC, the profound loss and grief that Plato has. And Whitehead is right, Western philosophy is in many ways but a series of footnotes to Plato, but Plato is grounded in profound sorrow with the death of his mentor. That's the dark side of Plato, different from Platonism, of course. The disciples, the followers, the epigoni, the reducers. And then Jesus, 333 AD, as it were. And that death on that cross. And one of the challenges of any serious talk about justice is, on the one hand, the unleashing of Socratic questioning that is quite explicit and engages in frank speech, plain speech, unintimidated speech, unafraid speech about justice as it relates to powers that be it empires, be it patriarchy, be it homophobia, be it class struggles being waged and denied, be it losing sight of precious gay brothers, lesbian sisters, bisexuals, or transgender folk, staying in contact with their humanity. But without tears, something's missing. Much is missing. The legacy of Jerusalem that begins with our precious Jewish brothers and sisters. A cry of affliction. That's Hebrew scripture. And a covenant, the high power that says to be human is to spread hesed, loving kindness to the weak, the vulnerable, the widow, the stranger, the fatherless, the motherless, the poor, the working people. And one does not have to have a cognitive commitment to God talk to understand how powerful the stories are that allow for the tears to flow, precisely because of a sensitivity to the unjustified suffering, unrealized potential of too many of our fellow human beings, no matter what color or gender or sexual orientation. And that legacy of Jerusalem, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. That's Amos. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with thy God. That's Micah. We could go on and on and on. What it's like to look at the world through the lens of those peoples who are subjugated and dominated. And we know much, if not most, of human history is a history of cycles of domination and exploitation and oppression. And even when we make breakthroughs, just reflected in that magnificent ninth thesis of Walter Benjamin, in his thesis on the philosophy of history, that angel of history trying to flap its wings in the face of the storms of catastrophe and the pilage of wreckage upon wreckage of generation after generation of poor and working peoples whose lives are often completely rendered invisible. And the very folk who talk about progress may in fact be constituting in some ways the storm itself. Benjamin, we need you, especially now, given pending ecological catastrophe, oftentimes promoted by the very folk in the name of progress. We've forgotten about possible nuclear catastrophe, echoes of Du Bois's activism in the early 50s. With Ukraine emerging, Cold War rhetoric escalating, and the nuclear missiles on both sides of the Russian Empire and the American Empire, echoes of post-World War II all over again. We thought after 1989 and 1991 it was over. Think again. Think again. A lot of times these issues can be overwhelming, but we have to be Socratic and having the courage to think critically about it. And we have to be prophetic in terms of our willingness not to remain spectators, but participants, willingness to shed tears, willingness to have one's conscience set on fire. Part of our problem, especially in the United States, I can't speak as much for Germany, but we have experienced an ice age in the United States. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to say, indifference to evil is more evil than evil itself, because there's a callousness toward catastrophe, and the indifference generates whole ways of life to turn your back on the weak and vulnerable. We in the States have 22% of our children living in poverty, the richest nation in the history of the world. That's a moral disgrace, spiritually profane. 40% of our red precious children, indigenous children, those whose land was dispossessed and violated in order for America to take off as a democratic experiment, living in poverty. 40% of brown, Latino and other Spanish-speaking children living in poverty. 39% of precious children who look like me, black, beautifully black, not me, but them, living in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. And when you turn toward our chocolate cities and see 1 out of 3 of our precious black brothers between 18 and 26 either in prison on parole or on probation. I've been teaching in prisons, as was noted, for 37 years now. At that time, we started with 400,000. There's now 2.6 million in the prison industrial complex. 60% of those in for soft drug offenses. We're not talking about murderers. We're not talking about rapists. We're talking about soft drugs, marijuana. I don't know what the culture is here in Germany. My hunch is there's some young folk flying high in the friendly sky every once in a while. 12% of young blacks addicted. 12% of young whites addicted. 65% of convictions, black. Even with a brilliant, charismatic black president who was relatively milquetoast and spineless when it comes to these kind of issues of justice. You see, refuses to speak clearly, refuses to straighten his back up. Why? Because He's a politician. He's got to deal with the right wing. He doesn't want to be too explicitly associated with poor and black people because that would reinforce the white anxiety and fears. Therefore, he cannot be honest about critiques of Wall Street as opposed to his Wall Street friendly policies. He can't engage in any serious critique of imperial policies like drones dropping bombs on innocent people. What is it now? 221 innocent children killed by U.S. drones, and not a mumbling critical word from so many other voices with a black president, in part because he's black. And I get in a lot of trouble in the United States and in Germany too, and everywhere I go, saying exactly the same thing. Namely, these are war crimes. Bush did it, I said they're war crimes. When Obama does it, they're war crimes. If Hillary comes in and she does the same thing, they're war crimes. Oh, Brother West, why are you so hard? Because I try to be morally consistent. Try to be morally consistent. What the great Jane Austen called constancy. I love that wonderful phrase in that bourgeois novelist that she was, magnificent novelist that she was. I have nothing against the bourgeoisie when they're wise and compassionate. I just can't stand the indifference and the callousness toward the weak and vulnerable. How do we bring together what I would call the spirituality? We can echo here the great Karl Rahner, our dear brother Karl Rahner. The spirituality of Socratic questioning with the spirituality of deep love, empathy, and compassion that begins with the least of these, but spills over and embraces everyone, no matter what class, color, gender, or sexual orientation. And I want to end, because I want to have a good time for question and answer here. But I began on a Socratic note, and I want to end on a blue note, because I think when we actually look at some of the grand visions, practices, forms of witness that bring together Socratic questioning and bring together prophetic witness, one of the places to look is the black freedom struggle. If I wanted to just embody what it is to bring together love of wisdom and love of neighbor, I could just put on John Coltrane's A Love Supreme right now and sit down. You say, oh, Brother West, that's music. Yes, Adorno understood. Ernst Bloch understood how fundamental the arts and music can be to keep track of utopian energies that spill over from below, from the demos, from those Sly Stone call everyday people, or those the great James Cleveland call ordinary people. And it's only when everyday people, ordinary people, decide to straighten their backs up. Brother Martin used to say, anytime ordinary people straighten their backs up, they're going somewhere, because folk can't ride your back unless it's bent. And when they begin to raise Socratic questions, why is it that in America 1% of the population owns 42% of the wealth? Occupy movement? They've got some Socratic questions. Why is it that profits could quadruple in 25 years at the top, but wages remain stagnating for 30 years? Trade union movement weak, feeble, greed running amok at the top. This is not an anti-rich message. This is an anti-injustice message. There's like a lot of people accuse me even being anti-American. I say, how can I be anti-American? I'm anti-injustice in America. I'm anti-injustice in Germany. I'm anti-injustice in Ethiopia, in Tel Aviv, West Bank, Guatemala, across the board. Because every flag, for me, as a revolutionary Christian, is under the cross. And that cross signifies the quest, the human fallen quest for unarmed truth. As Adorno puts it in the negative dialectics, about page 17, the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak when it comes to the human condition. And that second pillar is unconditional love. Unarmed truth, unconditional love. And that unconditional love is not solely a question of politics. Because when you listen to Coltrane's music, what you also find is a militant tenderness. Because tenderness is what love feels like in private. And tenderness is one of the very means by which we organisms from womb to tomb can be empowered to straighten our backs up. There's a subversive sweetness in Coltrane, Sarah Vaughan, Donny Hathaway, Nina Simone, Aretha Franklin. These are just not entertainers. Of course, we see this in terms of contemporary hip-hop studies. You see, these are not just money makers, even though they sing a lot about money, because most of them are broke as the Ten Commandments financially. They're poor. But they're part of a tradition of utopian dreams and energies spilling over. And there's no institutions and structures in place to channel those dreams, and therefore they get caught up in the marketizing, the commercializing, the commodifying of the corporate elites who control the radio recording and the video industries all at the same time. And therefore so many of our young people more and more hungry and thirsty for Socratic questioning. They want more than just smartness and dollars. They want Socratic questions tied to love of wisdom. They want prophetic witness tied to love of neighbor. And as a Christian, I believe in loving my enemies. I just don't try it on my own. I need a whole lot of grace for that. A whole lot of empowerment for that one. But all it means is no matter what people do in a particular moment, even if it's vicious, that doesn't fully define their humanity. They can change. They can be better. So you don't give up on them. They can be transformed. The way Malcolm Little was transformed into Malcolm X, because he was loved by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and transformed him into someone straightened his back up. Even he outgrows Elijah Muhammad himself and ends up a revolutionary Islamic brother, wrestling with the compatibility of democratic institutions with Islamic faith in that regard. I said I was going to end on a blue note. There's no serious talk about justice in our very dark and bleak time without talking about hope. You say, well, what is the relation between hope and the blues? Well, B.B. King's the king of the blues, and he says, nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. That's the blues. That's catastrophic. Remind you of Sophocles' Antigone. Every force in the world and cosmos against you. And yet B.B. stands there with a smile, with style, and a little help from Lucille, his guitar, with the history of a people that says we've been terrorized, traumatized, stigmatized for almost 400 years. But the best of who we are is manifest in what Emmett Till's mother said when she stepped to the lectern with her child who had just been murdered by cowardly American terrorists in Jim Crow Gut Bucket, Mississippi in August of 1955. And what did she say when she stepped to the lectern? She spoke on behalf of not just black people, not just Americans. She spoke on behalf of the best of the human spirit. The death of her only child. His head was 5 times the size of his ordinary head, and she decided to keep that casket open so the world could see. 50,000 people march through Robert Temple Church of God in Christ in the west side of Chicago 3 months before Rosa Parks sat down on a bus in order to stand up for justice in Montgomery, Alabama. What you got to say, Miss Teal, to the world? What Socratic insight? What prophetic witness? And what did she say? I don't have a minute to hate. I will pursue justice for the rest of my life. Power, spiritual maturity, moral fortitude, part of a social movement, keeping track of a vicious legacy of white supremacy, but it could have been male supremacy. Could have been anti-Jewish hatred. Could have been anti-Islamic Arab hatred. It could have been patriarchy. It could have been anti-imperial. It could have been critiques of corporate greed. I don't have a minute to hate. Why is that important? Because chickens do come home to roost. And when the demos wakes up and is hungry for justice, if we don't have people in place that can direct the struggle for justice toward love and justice rather than hatred and revenge, then it's over for all of us. It's over for all of us. And that's precisely one of the fundamental insights, it seems to me, that we can actually learn from a blues people. A blues people that now lives not simply in a blues nation, but more and more in a blues world, given the global capitalist economy and given the interdependency of our oligarchs and plutocrats and big banks and big corporations in every corner of the world. And do we have what it takes? It's an open question. It may indeed be the case that we as a species simply lack the spiritual, moral, and political resources to sustain ourselves on the planet. And we can't pass it on to the next generation. That is very real and possible. But in the meantime, we hold on and we have the courage to hope. Meaning what? We are in no way optimistic. I have never been an optimist. I'm a blues man in the life of the mind. And the blues man is a prisoner of hope, not a promoter of optimism. And hope is simply about trying to sustain the human effort, the motion, the momentum, and movement toward that integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue that Du Bois was talking about, and that love that Niebuhr referred to. Thank you all so very much. We'll have a good time for questions.
Thank you so much for this inspiring and touching talk, and ending on a blue note opens up, I think, the discussion very well. And we are prepared, if you have no questions, to go on talking, but we've been doing that for 2 days now, so I think it would be much more fun for both of us if you actually ask questions, if you have any challenges. Falls Sie auf Deutsch fragen wollen, kann ich auch gerne übersetzen. So the floor is open to any questions, both on this presentation or the context of what Cornel had to say. So please feel free.
Dr. West, how important do you think providence is for justice?
I mean, we talk about providence, providence small p, providence capital P, but I tend to be one that puts a stress on just how limited human minds can be when it comes to things divine. And so providence for me is always something that is shot through with so much mystery, and the magnitude of the mystery is such that it's hard for human discernment to put it forward with any sense of certainty. And therefore, you know, when T.S. Eliot says, ours is in the trying, the rest is not our business, I do resonate a bit with that. And of course, Eliot's a high church Anglican. He's also crypto-fascist, but you got to keep the genius away from the fascism. And his insights, his spiritual insights are real. Therefore, for me, I tend to be highly suspicious of those who invoke providence, capital P. And usually, providence small p is like Hegel's Isle of Minerva that spreads its wings upon the falling of the dust. It's a retrospective claim. We can see in the past what it was, but it's hard to see it in the present. And it's nearly impossible to predict it in the future, you see. But did you have any thoughts on this, though, brother? I appreciate your question.
I found a satisfactory answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we can talk afterward, and you can let me know some text that I need to read that could convince me otherwise. But I tend to be highly suspicious of things divine. I'm not a skeptic because I'm skeptical of skepticism, but I believe there's a truth in skepticism that has to do with our fallibility. This is part of the pragmatic tradition of the great John Dewey and William James and Richard Rorty and Susan Langer and others.
And I saw another question over here. Please go ahead.
Also, Herr West hat sehr starke Wörter gebraucht in seiner Gegenwartsanalyse. Und dabei habe ich mich gefragt, ob, ich sage mal, ist ein bisschen provokativ, hätte dieser Vortrag vor 20 Jahren genauso lauten können? Und andere hypothetische Frage, könnte er in 20 Jahren wieder genauso sein? Also, oder anders gefragt, gibt es nicht tatsächlich so etwas wie einen Fortschritt in der Gerechtigkeit? Jetzt auf die US-amerikanische Gesellschaft auch bezogen und den Rassismus meinetwegen, der dort herrscht.
All right, so the question is, you did use very strong words analyzing the present moment, and his question is if you could have given the same talk 20 years ago, or if you could give the same talk in 20 years, and that is related to the second question, is there progress in American society? Is there change? So, is it the present moment you are describing, or do we have a development?
Yeah, thank you for the question, though, brother. One, of course, I can never jump 20 years ahead because that's counterfactual, hypothetical. We don't know whether the globe will even exist. But 20 years ago, I would have had the same kind of criticism of a neoliberal regime in the United States under Bill Clinton. He and I had major clashes when he signed the crime bill, 3 strikes you're out, that escalated the prison industrial complex. When he eliminated welfare, the government no longer had any obligation to its poor people. And when he deregulated, of course, Wall Street undercutting Glass-Steagall and allowed for the unleashing of the greed at the top of corporations, especially banks. And of course, 30 years ago, the profits in the United States were about 29–30% of the profits went to corporations. Today, 41% of profits go to banks. And there's a difference between corporations that at least produce products and banks that produce deals, where the money remains in private hands, so it doesn't generate any kind of productive value on the ground in terms of the real economy. So you end up with the shadow financial system, the casino, betting and so forth, with unbelievable profits, billions of dollars. And of course, what is it now, $2.3 trillion that banks and corporations have offshore. It can't be touched. You see. So that my critique of neoliberalism would have been similar. But I think there was a disappointment, of course, in our dear brother Barack Obama. We thought maybe, even as a neoliberal, he would tilt a bit toward the left and have some concern with the working class and poor and so on. That turned out not to be the case, even with the health care bill that's still driven by big pharmaceutical and private insurance companies. So that there is a similarity of 20 years ago, but there's also a deeper sense of disappointment. But I do think that there's a slow awakening. I mean, again, the Occupy movement was just one small example. It takes a number of different forms, especially among the younger generation. Especially among the younger generation, you see. And that's one reason why I have shifted so many of my lectures to high schools and junior high. We're going to meet some high school students here, right? In Hanover. I can't wait to engage. So, Anne Marie, I want to thank you for your wonderful work, too. God, you've been here at this institute from the very beginning and still going strong. Give our sister Anne Marie. She's the founding mother. The founding fathers are gone. The founding mother. Absolutely. But the important thing is that you have to keep on fighting. No matter what, you have to keep on fighting because this is a calling. It's not just a career.
Further questions or points where you would like more clarification?
I wonder if we are in philosophy too much preoccupied with the question of justice. Should we not more think about injustice? Is it more important, do we waste too much time developing theories of justice instead of working on a living sense for injustice?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I mean, I remember when I first read Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, and it looked as if his argument was a kind of Hegelian negation. It was over against reification, which is a form of commodification, rationalization, as well as bureaucratization. So you got Marx, you got Weber, and you got Georg Simmel. Simmel's philosophy of money and Weber's critique of rationalization and Marx's critique of commodification. People say, well, Lukács, you have a contra argument against reification. Do you have a positive standard that you're actually presupposing? And in light of my wrestling with that, Lukács still means much to me, even given his vicious Stalinist leanings later on in his life. God, I've been invoking a whole lot of folk with some ugly connotations, and yet we can learn from him, and I think that's something that's very important. The Heideggers and Lukács and others, one can steal, the Ezra Pounds and others, you can still learn much. That I do think we need both, though, Brother Jürgen, I do. I think that if we talk too much about injustice, we become so contra and over against that we don't remember not only what we're fighting for, but what will sustain us as long-distance runners toward something that can uplift all of us, appeal to the better angels of our nature. And of course, for me as a Christian, it's very much about the beloved community, which is always a regulative ideal. It's always a regulative ideal. We'll never, ever be realized in space and time, but it lures us if, in fact, we have a calling of trying to take seriously that Palestinian Jew named Jesus. And in that sense, it's the love call, caravan of love, love train, trying to stay on it. So we need both, analysis of the injustice, but also that positive sense of what can possibly be, even if it's manifest only in the tenderness and sweetness and gentleness and some small network within one's own small micro-social institution, from family, a mosque, a church, a synagogue, a trade union, or, well, should I say academy? I guess there's some utopian moments in the academy. It is constituted by human beings. But I mean, the academy in the States, you know, has become so rationalized and commodified and characterized by raw ambition among its inhabitants. That's one of the reasons why you don't find a lot of courage there, but a lot of smartness and concern about dollars too. And that's not a positive thing. That's not a positive thing at all. I see it among the prisoners. And we're talking about gangsters, you know. And I say gangsters in the very all-embracive sense. Because I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and I'm just a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities now. All of us shot through with the worst, you see. And I see utopian moments in those classes. We read Augustine, we read Plato, we read Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, we read Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun, we read Toni Morrison's Beloved. And these are all male because, of course, they have segregated prisons. 150 black and brown brothers. I think we got 2 vanilla brothers in the whole class because there's so few vanilla brothers in the prison. The prison's about 85% black and brown in the United States.
Mark, you are next.
Yeah, thanks very much for a very inspiring and lively talk.
Thank you.
I've never seen something like that before. But my question is, I really like the idea about learning how to die, which is a very ancient and philosophical idea. And my thought was, you know, those philosophers who developed that idea, they didn't have to work hard, they were part of a leisure class, so they had the freedom to do that process of, critically re-examining their selves and their relation to others and to the world. But I would say there are a lot of people who don't have that freedom. And since you connected the ability to learn how to live with justice, would you say that injustice starts where people do not have the freedom to do that process of self-critical examination, which seems to be synonymous for you with that process of learning how to die?
No, appreciate your kind words and the question. No, I think that even our fellow citizens, fellow human beings, who work from sun up, sun down, or in jobs where they experience intense alienation or manipulation from bosses who are often cruel and indifferent, that they still have the time for substantial self-criticism and self-interrogation, you see. I'll give you an example. My own descendants, dignified Africans enslaved, 244 years. No right to learn how to read or write. And most viciously, ugly, no right to bury their dead. That's the ultimate form of dehumanization. That's what happened to our Jewish brothers and sisters during the Holocaust, right? It was not simply the violation of wounds or scars. When you deny a people the right to bury their own dead, there's no other deeper violation of their humanity because it connects them with the past, present, and future. And that's what black folk had in the United States for over 100 and some years. But what happened? We steal away at night, hold hands in the ring, shout. It's against the law to worship God without white supervision. So what do? We stole away at night. Brother Anthony knows what I'm talking about. Yes, stole away at night, raised their voices. What do? Swing low, sweet chariot. Started singing the spirituals. In those spirituals, Socratic questioning. In those spirituals, self-interrogation. In those spirituals, trying to sustain some humanity. And under those severe circumstances, my own descendants could still be Socratic and prophetic. In which 257 slave insurrections, every slave insurrection resulted in the death of every slave who participated. Now that's what you call a lost cause. A noble cause, but a lost one. Nat Turner, Gabriel Broser, and so forth and so on. Now, under those circumstances, you think, my God, if they can do it, even modern workers who work from 8 until 7, when they steal away, maybe they could either turn off the TV or try to watch the right channels. That would generate some Socratic questioning and some kind of prophetic engagement with the world. You see the point I'm trying to make? I do think that it is possible, even given historically the privileged status of most philosophers. Epictetus and others were slaves. I mean, we got some counterexamples here. But most philosophers, you're absolutely right. But I think it's a human thing. All of us want to make sense of our move from womb to tomb. And that requires some critical engagement, who we are, what kind of persons we are. And usually those questions are raised most intensely when we are standing before the coffins of our loved ones. And you say, my God, how is their afterlife connected to my life? How can I be true to the best of who they were? Can I still put a smile on their face from the grave? What is connection between past, present, and future? That is profoundly Socratic. And all human beings undergo those kind of existential catastrophes of dealing with loss of loved ones, betrayal of friends, and so forth and so on.
Further questions? I saw one all the way in the back, please.
Good evening. I really appreciated your analysis of educational institutions turning their students into economic subjects rather than free thinkers. So I'm struggling with this all day since I got to university. So I'm interested in your vision or in some sort of idea of an economy that creates global justice, because you named the free market system as one of the major causes for injustice in the world.
No, I appreciate your query. I mean, one would be trying to forever be mindful of the difference between a democratic model of paideia or deep education with a market model of schooling And schooling and education are in no way the same thing at all. And in the United States, for example, Diane Ravitch, who's one of our major historians of American education, she talks about how rich kids get taught and poor kids get tested because of the preoccupation of profits now trying to privatize public education, tied to tests as a major determinant for evaluating whether education is taking place. And in so many of our so many of our cities, arts programs have been eliminated completely. That's why in hip-hop we don't have great artists who can play instruments. We have great artists who can talk, like Jay-Z and Kanye West. But they can't play an instrument to save their lives. And they don't produce groups that sing in harmony like the Temptations and the Miracles and the Dramatics and the Whispers and the Emotions and Enchantment. Because in order to sing in harmony, you have to learn how to listen and have a faculty of receptivity, not just aggressivity of your ego or microphone tied to a big contract to stimulate bodies and not stir people's souls. Am I talking too fast, though?
No, I think at this point it's too late anyway.
Yeah, that's right. I was told
Thanks
not
for
to
asking.
talk too fast. It's very hard for me not to talk too fast, but you all been so patient, I appreciate. But you see the point I'm saying, my dear sister? The democratic model and the market model. John Dewey's great work, Democracy and Education. Very important starting point, and that's almost 100 years old. The problem of the public. That's almost 80 years old, you know what I mean? But the sense of a democratic model of education, because we know skills are very important. You got to deal with the labor force, you got to deal with the market and so forth. But when it becomes so ubiquitous, it becomes a form of idolatry. And it squeezes out the non-market values, like love, justice, even truth, advertisement, commercials, brand, you know, the worst thing you could ever tell young folks. You got to make sure you polish your brand. No, you're not a brand. You're a human being choosing a cause. You don't die for a brand. You die for a cause. But it's all now marketized, existentially, psychologically, politically, and so forth and so on, you see. That's a dystopia in the worst sense of it. And so I salute your struggle. I believe there's always a tension. The end is not to eliminate the tension, is to try to produce a creative tension as opposed to a destructive tension. So you live in the tension in the university with you being pushed to become an economic subject. I love the way you put that, as opposed to a free thinking subject. That's much clearer than my own language. I appreciate how you put that. But it's a tension, and all of us have to wrestle with it until the day we die.
And I think we have time for one more question, and the gentleman in the middle, in the back, has been waiting for quite a while. Thank you for waiting.
Thank you, Mr. West. I appreciate your talk, but I'm a little bit uncertain whether you really have hit the core. Why didn't you talk about the truth of property right? Because if we have found out, as you showed us, that the wealth is climbing up and is aggravating, so why don't you simply smash that table you're in front of to question our dogma of property rights? Because they enable the rich to get richer and the poor to remain poor. Thank you.
You mean smash this table? No, I know you're speaking metaphorically, though, and I appreciate the force of your question, though, brother. No, I think what I was trying to do, though, and you tell me what you think, so we can go back and forth a little bit on this. What I was trying to do was simply open up a public space for a robust, uninhibited dialogue with a variety of different perspectives. And my own perspective certainly tends toward a critique of what you're talking about. I'm not as certain as you are as to whether direct kind of either symbolic action or even some sense of what one replaces it with that has to be talked about. We have to have some serious kind of critical reflection upon it. And you also have to have agents in place, insurgents, collective insurgencies, counterinsurgency groups in place that have a vision that is genuinely democratic, because one can go about smashing X and Y and just end up with new replacements that are authoritarian and autocratic, you see. And that's something that we have to be very sensitive to in light of the barbarism of the 20th century. It doesn't mean that we can't talk about socialism, we can't talk about communism, we can't talk about anarchism, but you also have to be very honest in terms of what can be done in the name of smashing X or smashing Y, metaphorically. I know you're just talking metaphorically now in that regard. So that, yeah, you're right, I didn't come to that core because I'm still a little bit, not so much suspicious, but I'd want to hear more from you as a brother and comrade and so forth as to what follows from that particular kind of move. And even what your analysis of the thing that you're radically calling into question, because here I was not spending a lot of time analyzing one particular right or one particular element in a larger form of free market fundamentalism that I was talking about in a looser sense. So I appreciate your forceful comment in that regard, but just look forward to subsequent dialogue, even as this remains in place.
I claim that you are always awake. May I take 2 more questions?
Oh,
all right.
Absolutely.
This gentleman up front here.
Thank you very much for your presence. I appreciate it. My idea of getting justice is in my mindset just right now as a human and practitioner of hip-hop culture. With the words of Kwame Ture, how to organize. I mean, yes. And this is just a simple question and a small space to give an answer, but as you are traveling a lot, meeting a lot of people coming from my ancestors' land, you know, my Mecca. What's your perspective of already organized people, or maybe a little bit of a look into the future? You mean not 20 years, but what can happen, or, I mean, yeah, just an idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, one, we do want to acknowledge, I want to acknowledge my own relation to Stokely Carmichael and Kwame Ture. A new book recently published by Peniel Joseph on Stokely, A Life. He and I just had an intense and wonderful conversation in New York City at Union Square just this past week. The book just came out this past week. And I'm just so glad that people are concerned and focusing on Stokely Carmichael and Kwame Ture, because he comes out of a tradition in which organizing is at the center. He is a son of Ella Baker. He's a son of Fannie Lou Hamer. Now, he's also a son of Malcolm X and was the best friend of Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, you recall when he called for Black Power on Bloomsday, June 16th, 1966, he said, "I've been arrested 27 times and I'm 24 years old. I want Black Power." Now, all America picked up on was Black Power. It scared them to death, especially on the vanilla side of towns. It just got, Black Power, they're going to kill us. No. They just want justice, but that's a way of talking about it. But he'd been to jail 27 times, and he wasn't 25 years old yet. See, when you talk about organizing, you're talking about that kind of courage and commitment. That's part of what I meant by being a blues person, a long-distance runner. We were talking with Brother Metz last night. He's a long-distance runner, 85 years old, still speaking the truth about suffering. That's a hard thing to do. It's rare in our day because most of us want push-button success, overnight panaceas. Try things out for a week, go to an Occupy movement for a day, doesn't look like Wall Street is budging, let me go on back to the suburbs and sip tea and watch television. No, you got to put your body in it, your mind in it, your soul in it, in the long run. Now, that is grassroots organizing. Right? That's a little different than the social media just surfing and showing up once or twice. That's deep grassroots organizing. Part of the challenge is there's market time and there's democratic time. The grassroots organized democratic time is much slower. Market time is quick. It's hyper. 24 cycle, news and so forth and so on. And we have yet to crack that nut as to how you awaken folk in such a way that you sustain it. Now, it looked like with the Arab Spring, we had now some global waves. Northern Africa taught folks some lessons from Tunisia and Egypt and what have you. Lord, large numbers of people showing up can actually topple autocratic regimes. But then the question becomes what happens after, role of the military, will it turn on itself? And we've seen this over and over again in serious talks about either revolution or fundamental transformation. So I'm committed to both forms of organizing. Grassroots organizing, the kind of organizing that Stokely Carmichael and Kwame Ture did, but also using the market. You see, use one's status, public status, celebrity status, whatever it is. Tell the truth, expose lies, be part of going to jail, be part of hitting the streets. And when we got arrested and stop and frisk in New York City, where the mayor of New York City, Bloomberg, had stopped and frisked 4.2 million young black and brown folk over 9 years, and only 1.2% of them associated with crime. And we went to jail, we had a trial, went on for a week, we were convicted, and lo and behold, there little increase in discourse of stop and frisk. A little more increase. Now we got a mayor who's not calling for the end, but he's calling to amend it, and it was very much that issue that allowed for de Blasio to move in. The question is whether de Blasio is going to be another Obama, which is to talk progressive and govern neoliberal. And we're putting pressure on that brother. But we're giving him a chance. He said, we're giving him a chance. We're going to keep making him accountable. Not just in regard to that, but also in regard to financial elites and so forth. You see. And of course, as mayor, he can only do so much. And we understand that with mayors, they're not running things, but they do have power and they play a very important role, and they got bully pulpit, so they can actually talk about issues, be it green, be it working class, be it poor, and so forth, you see. And that's the kind of pressure, loving pressure, we put on de Blasio. But it's two different kinds of organizing. So when in market time, when democratic time, as an artist, you move back and forth, because you have to be able to get some visibility, and you get visibility through, unfortunately, the market. And I say unfortunately because the possibility of it getting dumbed down, the possibility of it being flattened out increases. But on the other hand, you never know when the breakthrough is going to take place. You just don't know. You know, in the 60s, we didn't think that a breakthrough was going to take place. Lo and behold, the overflow took place. The overflow. And even when the progress takes place, Brother Malcolm used to tell us, you don't stab folk in the back 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches, and celebrate your progress. Still got a lot of work to do.
Just a little bit of work for you left, 2 further questions, and then we'll take other questions out for the wine. So, this lady here.
Hi, how are you?
How you doing, my dear sister?
Thanks for all the nice speech. My question is more on the personal level, I would say. It's maybe, it has also, of course, a philosophical dimension, but I think the first point is maybe I'm in a kind of crisis or something, but maybe I get 30 and I have a kind of existential crisis. But my point is I have the feeling at the moment we speak a lot about justice and injustice in Germany, but it's very unemotional, I would say. This is what you, or maybe unempathic, I don't know how to say, but you spoke about Jesus, who was not, who was never seen being laughing and not crying. So these are like emotions. And my question is, I think it's very difficult to speak too rational about justice, because sometimes I have the feeling, especially in Germany, it's very rational, it's very unemotional, and we try to understand a lot the other, but we are not really empathic with the other. And I feel it also a lot in not only universities, but I already finished my studies and I am a political scientist, and I see also if I speak, of course, with politicians, they are very rational about it, and it's a kind of way not to really feel with the other, yeah, and this is a problem for me. And sometimes this is why I also have a question. One, how can we I don't know, act to make people maybe more emotional with the other before getting rational and thinking about solutions? This is one question. And the other is, what do you do if you are really desperate? Because I have really moments where I got tired being critical, I have moments where I go home and I'm desperate and I think like I even don't have, I mean, of course there are possibilities like listen to music. I love hip hop too and being strong, but of course you have these moments where you are really weak and tired of being critical. And I think this is the moment where I really struggle with myself the most, because I think it's really my duty to stay critical, and at the other time, of course, there are these moments you feel completely alone with, as if I'm weird. I'm for sure weird, but I mean, like really weird. And so my question is, and also, I think I live in the time where people like think, when you are 30, like I am, people really think I'm weird that I read philosophy in my free time. I mean, it's not really common in my generation. I don't know, maybe this is also just my perspective, but sometimes I say, oh my God, I would like to live in the 70s. It was such a powerful time. But maybe this is a romantic view towards the past, you know? And maybe I'm living in a 70 time and I'm not noticing it because I'm tired or something else. So you see, it's a range of questions, but maybe you can say something about what you said about laughing and crying, and this is also part of justice and maybe pre-assumption also for justice.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that heartfelt question. No, I think any generation is a critical prophetic minority who's reading a lot of philosophy. Reading philosophy has never been a mass movement. It's never been a mass movement, no matter which generation it is. But I'd like to see more just as a teacher and professor. Second, though, I do want to accent, though, when I talked about Socrates not shedding a tear, then I shifted to my Jewish brothers and sisters, beginning with cries. And then Jesus weeps. He weeps for Lazarus. He weeps for Jerusalem. You see it? So he's part of a weeping tradition in stark contrast to Socrates. Now, Socrates doesn't speak for all the Greeks because Sophocles and others have weeping figures too. But the point is this the role of empathy you hit right on the head. We can say the same thing about Hamlet. You know, he suffers from the incapacity to love, the incapacity to empathize too. And he's probably the greatest protagonist of all of modern Western literature. Shakespeare, what do you have in mind with your Jesuit education? What is going on, William? Reread Hamlet again with all of that philosophical sophistication, but something hollow at the core. Echoes of what we'll see in Eliot's The Hollow Men later, many, many years later. Your question is such a crucial one. And I see, I would want to say that when you think of German, see, when I think of German culture, I think of the incomparable Beethoven. I think of Wieland's translations of Shakespeare. I think of Lessing. I think of Schiller. I think of these towering folk. To say that Beethoven doesn't have emotion, somebody not listening to the brother. Opus 131, the greatest string quartet ever written, and the dialectic of emotion and constraint that's going on in those movements are beyond description. But what happens with Hitler that casts such a shadow over German culture. So a lot of people, when they think of German culture, that's all they think of is Hitler. I have to try to educate them. Say, look, the man was a thug and a gangster, but he in no way expresses the essence of German culture. He just won, and gangsters that win and are not pushed back engage in levels of unprecedented cruelty, and he was able to get away with a whole lot. I think most cultures and nation states actually have potential Hitlers. They might not zero in just on Jewish brothers and sisters or socialists or communists or gays and lesbians, but all cultures have these deep gangster, thugs, autocratic propensities. He was just able to get away with it. So I say, let's just be fair to the German brothers and sisters. Yes, Hitler needs, the Holocaust needs, the Shoah needs to be wrestled with continuously every day. We got to die every day. But don't forget about Beethoven, Wieland, Lessing, Kant, Herder. I mean, you got all these folk in German culture too. Now, what happens, I think, in the present moment is, anytime you talk about emotionalism in Germany, they think it's a Nazi movement. Oh, because I mean, my dear brother Habermas. You know, I love my brother, but he's not right all the time. We know that. And anytime you get emotionalism, you get irrationalism. Irrationalism leads towards fascism. Come on, Jerry. We can balance this thing. We're not against rationality. We're not against constraints. We're not against decorum. We're not against understanding the limits of irrationality and keeping our focus on vicious forms of fascism that can emerge. But it doesn't mean then that every manifestation of group identity or every manifestation of a social movement is just Nazism lurking around the corner. That trumps any possibility of the kind of social activism of groups in a post-Nazi Germany. So I would say you go on and express yourself. If you're feeling down and out, you turn on a little John Coltrane as well as Beethoven. You can listen to some Brahms. Of course, he never smiles, but you listen to Alto Rhapsody. You listen to that Requiem. You listen to that Piano Concerto No. 2 in B flat. Oh my God, Brahms is flowing unbelievable with profound emotion. And yet you look at the picture of him. Looks like he's just as dead as a nail. Come on, Johannes. We know you're from Hamburg. Not a lot of emotion in your expression. Listen to my art and you'll see profound passion. And that's profoundly German too. Brahms. As a secular person writing the Requiem, no references to the biblical figures. But the death of his mother hit him hard. Catastrophe. Many years spent wrestling with that catastrophe. Unbelievable emotion and passion manifest. So it's a question in part of balance, and it's a question in part of understanding the historical context. And I'm speaking as an outsider. I could be completely wrong. I think I'm right, but I can be completely wrong.
All right, there's one person who seems to be desperate to ask a question. That's the final question before I close the door. Absolutely. In the back, black shirt.
Guten Abend, ich heiße Melchior. Ich freue mich, Sie heute hier live erlebt zu haben. Ich habe schon eine Menge von Ihnen auf YouTube gesehen bzw. gehört und es ist sehr bereichernd, Sie live zu erleben. Ich habe viele Fragen, die mir durch den Kopf gehen. Zu der Vorredner oder zu der Frage der 30-Jährigen, ich kann nur sagen, es gibt mehr von uns. Ich stelle mir die Frage, Sie haben von Beethoven gesprochen, ich stelle mir die Frage, in der heutigen Zeit, es gibt großartige Sachen, die Menschen in Anführungsstrichen produzieren, aber warum ist es heute nicht möglich, dass vielleicht jemand wie Beethoven wieder aufersteht, sprich ein neuer Beethoven entsteht? Wo ist die Zeit, wo ist der Raum, where's the space in mind, dass sowas wieder möglich ist? Heutzutage zählt Erfolg, es zählt Geld, es zählt Output. Können Sie mir eine Universität empfehlen, wo es nicht um Erfolg, um Leistung geht, um Noten? Wo finde ich das? Wo ist die Universität, die mir beibringt, wie ich lieben kann, was Liebe ist? Wo ist das? Where is it to find?
Yeah, no, appreciate that. Yeah, I think you can start by being part of the dialogues at the Institute for Philosophical Research here in Hanover. That's a good place. But I can't really answer your question in Germany, my dear brother. I don't really know the places and the dynamics, but from the dialogues that I've had with teachers and professors over the years, there are some magnificent...
Why don't you talk about how painful, how difficult it is to examine the life, to examine or to answer this question? How painful it is to become a certain kind of person? Why don't you talk about this?
Yeah, no, I thought I made some allusions to it when I first stepped up and I said the unexamined life is not worth living. The examined life is painful. You remember when I said that? It's very painful. Courage means that you're wrestling with pain. You're dealing with fear and trying to overcome it. But I thought your question was where to go in order to gain access to some subcultures in universities that accent the wrestling with this pain and so forth and so on. And that's why I'm saying I can't answer that. I can't say which particular university to go. But no, you're right, though. It's very painful There's no doubt about that, but it's also full of joy. And it very much so. And joy and pleasure, not the same thing. The joyless quest for pleasure that characterizes so much of our culture wants to escape from pain rather than work through the pain. No, very much so. I'm not sure we're radically disagreeing on this, even though I like your passion. She was talking about people, you want more passion among the German brothers and sisters. That's good to see you got it flowing.
That's what all about.
You say what?
I said, I'm very excited, sorry, but...
Oh, no, that's good. That's good. I'm excited too.
Big audition hier.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Ich würde gerne noch mal auf Deutsch was sagen. Ich habe den Eindruck, dass das hier so abläuft. Sie mit ihren Titeln und ihren Erfolgen stehen da vorne und erzählen uns was. Und viele Professoren, betitelte Menschen sitzen vorne in der ersten Reihe und hören ihnen aufmerksam zu und mit Sicherheit stimmen ihnen auch zu. Und ich frage mich, wo ist die Verantwortung eines jeden, der hier sitzt, so etwas auf die Beine zu stellen, wie Sie es getan haben? Ich glaube, dass viele von uns dazu befähigt sind und dass es möglich ist. Wo ist die Verantwortung eines jeden hier im Raum? Und eine Frage, die mir noch auf dem Herzen brennt, ist Wissen, Erfolg, Tradition. Was oder wie viel ist das alles wert, wenn wir nicht ein liebendes Herz haben?
Oh, yeah, no, I appreciate you finishing this out, though, brother. Now, I think that it's like the conclusion to a practical Aristotelian syllogism, which is not a proposition, but an action. It's a response. We were talking about that earlier today. Responsibility. It's a response. I put it out. There's a certain kind of call. There is a response. And there will be respective and distinctive responses that you're calling for. To take responsibility, to wrestle with the issues. I'm not asking people to agree with me. I'm not asking for unanimity. This is a Socratic dialogue. We go back and forth with each other. And you wrestle with your responsibility as I continue to wrestle with mine, but we in the end, I think we're all in it together. But I know we got to run. Thank you all so very much.
Well, thank you, Cornel.